Welcome to week 4, where we move from Greek culture into the Roman Empire, which was highly influenced by Greek culture. And then we'll be looking at two minority groups, the Jews and the early Christians, and the way that their work was influenced also by Roman culture. Now, when we look around us in the world today, many of the things that we see are influenced by Roman culture, from the laws that we use to the language that we use, the calendars, even the coins that we use. So after studying Roman art, you might begin to notice some of the influence it's had on the world around you. The Romans were unique in that they had an imperial purpose for their art. They used their portraits and historical reliefs as powerful propaganda. This was different than what we saw with the Greeks. The Romans had an empire to maintain, to establish, and they had emperors who needed to keep power. So they used images. They understood the power of images, and they used them to manipulate public opinion in favor of their political figures. So this is certainly not dissimilar to the way that politicians today use aggressive advertising campaigns and whatever else they can use, all kinds of imagery to gain popular support. So we'll also see how the Romans were the first to utilize and employ an innovative technology called concrete. It's another technology that we see around us every day that is influencing us at all times. So the legend is that Rome was founded in 1753 BCE by Romulus, who, with his twin brother Remus, was abandoned and then nursed by a she-wolf. So this founding narrative of who the Romans were had to do with the power and the grit and the strength of these people. You can imagine they were raised by wolves, basically. So it was started as a village of huts on 7 hills, and 900 years later it became the most powerful empire the world has ever known. In the context of that empire, the Hebrew people lived and followed their God. And in the 1st century CE, a Jewish rabbi named Jesus also lived, and his followers became the first Christians. And the earliest Christian art comes out of the context of ancient Rome. So we'll see some interesting ways in which Christian art related to the Roman culture in which it was developed, and that's something that's of particular interest to me, so you might see some of my excitement come through here. So to start with, we can talk a little bit about the Etruscans. They're mentioned in your book, but we don't have enough space to read much about them. But they were people who lived in Italy, central Italy, before the Romans, and eventually they were overtaken by the Romans, and their culture was subsumed by the Romans. But they had sophisticated techniques of bronze casting for making bronze sculptures, and so Roman patrons employed Etruscan artists. This portrait, the head of a man traditionally known as Brutus, was probably made by an Etruscan artist. The serious facial features, the knit brow, the commanding, stern, age-worn face expressed the Roman virtues that point to strength of character and the wisdom of age. These were different virtues than the ones that we saw with the Greeks. We're already seeing a contrast with the Greek art of last week. Although, again, the Romans were highly influenced by Greek art and obsessed with it at times. So, the Roman Republic, the first period that we'll look at in the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic period, before we get to the Empire, was ruled by an oligarchy. And during the Republic period, there were two classes, the wealthy upper class and the plebeian lower class. And the oligarchy ruled. The oligarchy came from the upper class. And during this Republican period, Romans venerated their ancestors by making death masks. So this practice of making death masks was a way of commemorating the ancestors after they died and preserving their legacy. And they would keep these masks in their homes. The death masks actually resembled the ancestors that they were meant to represent. So perhaps growing out of this early tradition of creating these death masks, a new Roman artistic ideal emerged during the Republican period in relation to portrait sculpture. The Roman ideal is distinctly different than the Greek ideal. The Greek ideal, if you remember, generalized features. It created smooth faces and smooth skin. Oftentimes the sculptures were of younger younger people. There were no imperfections. But the Romans instead emphasized old age, there were wrinkles, and they were interested in the individual likeness. So they observed individuals, and that was important in their sculpture. They were more interested in what the individual looked like and capturing that likeness than idealizing that person. So the oligarchical system lasted for about 450 years, but we will skip over after just one slide into the Roman Empire. Soon the empire was too big to be ruled by the Senate. The oligarchy was the Senate, and it ruled Rome, but the empire got too big, and so the emperors needed to step up. The first emperor was Octavian, born in 63 BCE. He was the successor to Julius Caesar, and he was given the title Augustus, hence the sculpture of Augustus of Prima Porta. Augustus means exalted or sacred. Near his death, he was also given the title Pontifex Maximus, or high priest. So not only was he exalted and sacred, that wasn't quite good enough. He also needed to be the high priest, meaning that the political and secular powers were fused in his person. They were united in him. So he represented both powers. You could say he was all-powerful. To facilitate the emperor's development and administration, the empire's development and administration, Augustus engaged in massive building projects to improve city life. From temples, markets, recreational facilities such as racetracks, theaters, public baths, housing, and political centers. He also built networks of roads and bridges that kept this vast empire connected. So, Augustus, like all the emperors, was a master of manipulating public perception. The emperors realized the power of images to manipulate our sense of reality, and here Augustus is depicted as an eternal youth. His power is also emphasized by the figures on his chest. So not only is his figure representative of who he is and the power that he has, but also the story that's told by the figures that are in relief on his chest also tell a story about his power. It's the story of the diplomatic victory over the Parthians. So the sculpture of Augustus of Prima Porta, portrays him in the way he wants to be remembered. Again, he's young, like I said. He's also in the stance of the Roman orator. So the outstretched hand, holding the hand out there, was a representation of speaking. So that is how he's portrayed. But he's also depicted with the Greek proportions and contrapposto promoted by Polykleitos. And we saw that last week, contrapposto, where one leg is taking all the weight and the other one is relaxed. That kind of balance is at the heart of this idea of contrapposto. So you see that Greek and Roman, those two artistic traditions fused again in this sculpture. Another way in which this sculpture reveals his power is through the symbolic iconography. And we talked about the difference between symbolic and natural iconography. Well, look at the little cherub next to his right leg down there. That is Cupid, the son of Venus. And it's a reference to his divine heritage. The Julians claimed to be descendants of Venus. For the Roman emperors, it was important to show that the king shared in divinity. He was both human and divine in a sense, and he adopted all kinds of names to enhance this idea, such as King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He was called the Savior. Emperors were called the Saviors, and Sons of Gods. Again, the figures on his chest depict a diplomatic victory over the Parthians. They're returning a military standard to a Roman soldier or a goddess, the goddess Roma. And these kinds of images of emperors were very important because citizens were required to treat the image of the emperor in the same way that they would treat the emperor themselves. So we will see how that comes into play in the future. Now, turning to a more private setting, Pompeii was preserved because there was an eruption of the Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, and it was not excavated until the 19th century. And in this context, here we have a house And there's highly illusionistic painting here. You can see, excuse me, these representations of what would have been panel painting, but instead they're just painted right on the wall. And then the highly illusionistic paintings include representations of marble. So you see that down here. And this marble is found on the colorful dado between the images that decorate the interior. The dado are the lower parts of the wall. So that's where you find this illusionistic painting of marble. It's not actually stone. It's actually just a painting of stone. This technique of illusion continued here in Boscoriali. And in this house, the illusion on the wall opens you into a new world. So this is a painting, but it gives you the sense that you're in a whole new space. It opens you from your house into another space. Another image from this same house uses intuitive perspective. So when you look at the depiction of space here, again, it's this illusionistic painting is opening you from your house into a new space, into a whole new world almost. But you see the sense of perspective, which shows that things that are smaller or things that are further away in the background are smaller. Things that are closer are bigger. And then there's also diagonal lines that represent the way that space recedes into the background. This intuitive perspective is based on the way that we observe perspective, but it's an approximation of that perspective. And it's distinct. Intuitive perspective is distinct from linear perspective and one-point perspective or two-point perspective. All those names are kind of interchangeable. That's developed in the Renaissance, and that's a mathematically standardized method of perspective in which all the lines converge on 1 point or 2 points. It's less intuitive and it's less of an approximation. Just so you know the technical differences between different kinds of perspective. Now we're going to move to, excuse me here, I'm losing my paper. We're going to move to the Parthenon. Or the Pantheon, sorry, that was in the wrong place. Okay. We're going to move into this architectural structure. In the 1st century BCE, the innovative use of concrete was considered to be a technological breakthrough. Concrete was really important because it meant that no longer were the Romans required to use specialized skilled masons in order to hewn rock out of the ground in order to build their building projects. Instead, they could pour concrete, which could be mixed by unskilled laborers, and this revolutionized the Roman building projects. Concrete was so strong because it was made of a mixture of powdered lime, volcanic sand and rocks, and ceramic pieces and other debris. And once these things were mixed with water, they caused a chemical reaction that then hardened as it dried. They also strengthened their concrete, protected it by covering it with a veneer of marble. You can see page 196 in your book for an explanation of all the wonders of concrete. So it allowed for them to do a lot more. For example, in this case, in the Pantheon, the concrete is what allows them to create the domed structure, the curved walls of the Pantheon. Now, on the left-hand side here, in this left-hand image, you get what the Pantheon looks like from the outside. For ancient Romans, as they approached this temple from the outside, the dome and rotunda were hidden from view. So they went through a restricted courtyard that's not there anymore. And then they did not realize that the building, unless they'd been there, of course, but they couldn't see that the building was a cylindrical shape, and so they didn't see the dome. This allowed for an element of surprise, so that once you enter the domed space, its impact is all the more spectacular because it's unexpected. So the breathtaking sense of this space is based on the oculus that's in the hole at the top of the dome, which opens up to the sky. It's just straight open to the sky. It can even rain in the Pantheon. This disc allows for light to move through the space throughout the day. It allows for the light to descend into the space, and it creates a curated sense of nature for the viewer as they walk through and as they experience that light. So I'm going to move through time chronologically. Your book takes you through the Roman Empire until the time of Constantine, but I'm going to skip into the Christian period because it's ongoing during the Roman Empire. And as I said, it grows out of the milieu of the Roman Empire. So we will look at early Christian art. The Christian culture was originally the culture of slaves. They were invisible for the first 150 years. They were no different materially from the rest of Roman culture. In fact, though, Clement of Alexandria's quote shows how early Christians interpreted images. So they reinterpreted the images that were already available and made them point toward the truths of their faith. So, for example, in this quote, the image of a fisherman would be interpreted by the Christian as a reference to the apostles fishing for people, although non-Christians might not interpret the image in the same way. So they had these rings. They would press these rings into the wax. It would be like their signature. It would be on the wax of a document that they would be sending to somebody. And each of these rings had its own image. So these are sealing rings, and Clement says, let our seals be either a dove or a fish or a ship. So a dove would represent the Holy Spirit. A fish comes up in the New Testament a lot in different narratives. It was also the symbol of the early Christians. Or a ship scudding before the wind, or a musical lyre which Polycrates used, or a ship's anchor which Seleucus got engraved as a device. And if there be one fishing, he will remember the apostle and the children drawn out of the water. So what does this mean? Christians were using pre-existing Roman images such as fish or an anchor or grapes. They weren't the elites of the Roman culture, so they didn't have the human capital or the money really to hire their own artists. So they had to make use with Roman artists. Their imagery was no different than the imagery around them, but by reinterpreting the imagery of imperial power to mean something referencing their own religion, they're in a sense subverting that imperial power, because they're taking what was meant to honor, say, an emperor and taking it to honor God. They are transforming the imagery around them. They're taking the chance to take what they see around them and remake it, reinterpret it. It's a very creative act. They use the language of Roman imperialism as well to name the only one true God. And they subvert the divinity of the emperors who thought that they were sons of God, the emperors who thought that they were divine. And they use that same language in order to help people understand the transcendent God who's beyond history. But they use these images that would help people make sense of who God was. So the early examples of Christian art come from a place called Dura Europos. And there are also images that we will see in the catacombs. There are also examples of sculpture that we're not going to look at, but most of those examples of early Christian sculpture created before the 4th century are of sarcophagi and small statues, but we won't get a chance to look at much of that. So in Dura Europos was a city at the edge of the Roman Empire, built in the 2nd century CE. It is in modern-day Syria, and there were all kinds of groups: Roman soldiers, Germans, Africans, and followers of many religions who lived there. So it was a very diverse culture, and they all had a somewhat similar visual aesthetic, similar visual cultures. There was a siege of this city, Dura Europos, and during the siege, Roman soldiers fortified the walls against attack by filling in the houses that were built against the city walls with debris. So you see this image here showing a step-by-step filling in of the city wall to fortify it, to strengthen it against attack. But the city was lost, and either everyone died or fled. But the areas next to the walls were preserved because nobody dug them out, and they were excavated in the 1930s. So what was there was preserved for almost 2,000 years. And what was there, it just so happens, was a house church that was built against the wall, as well as a Jewish synagogue that was also in a house, also built against the wall. And one thing that you might know about the Jewish law is that it prohibits the creation of images in the likeness of God. The Jewish prohibition of images, the Jewish prohibition of the worship of idols, which is the prohibition against a graven image, this prohibition made the production of sculpture in the round most suspect. So think of the golden calf, how egregious that was against God. The Hebrew people had been taken out of Egypt by God, and they sense that he has abandoned them, and they create a sculpture, a gold sculpture of a calf to worship. That is obviously not good. That's a no-no. But even if sculptures were frowned upon, the Jewish art did incorporate figurative imagery that was inspired by classical Greek and Roman art. So here you see a painting on the synagogue wall in Dura Europos. A synagogue is any room where the Torah is kept. The Torah is the Jewish law. So a synagogue could be a home, as it was here. So the long-held belief, scholarly belief of the time, that Jews did not create any sort of figural art was refuted by the discovery of Dura Europos. So here we have an image of the infancy of Moses, the story of him being hidden in the reeds and then taken by the Egyptian princess. And here's another depiction of Moses. Here you have an image in which Moses is pictured twice. First, he's parting the sea so that the Israelites can walk through. Then he points his staff again so that the Egyptians will drown. And we will see the use of the staff, or the use of what is in Roman iconography, the magic wand, to indicate power. So the baptistry, or this baptistry, was also preserved, and this was found in a house church in Dura Europos. So in this image, here you see a cutaway of the house church, where people would have met to celebrate communion, the Eucharist together. And then here is where they would have been baptized. And here is a photograph of the baptismal font. The baptismal is in the shape of a tomb, and that might seem a little bit strange at first until you think about the symbolism of baptism, which represents rebirth. Well, it also represents the death of the sinner and rebirth into new life. So basically, death to sin and redemption and resurrection in life in Christ. So you go down into the water, you metaphorically die to yourself and to your sin, and come back up again and are reborn and cleansed by the water. So the imagery of death is reinforced by this image of the tomb, by this shape of the tomb, but there's another image of a tomb here that's present right next to the font. This is a depiction, this painting here is a depiction of two women visiting the tomb of Christ. But it's not only death that is represented here, because this is an image depicting the exact moment when the women find the tomb empty. So it is also a depiction of resurrection. Again, if you right above the baptismal, there is another image of salvation. This is in the lunette above the baptismal basin. This is a detail image of that. And it's an image of Christ as the shepherd. So another image of God's salvation. And once again, salvation is depicted in another way through the healing of the paralytic. And in this story you have Jesus pointing at the paralytic on his mat, and then the paralytic lifting up his mat to walk. So that sense of redemption and rebirth. In the catacombs, where Christians buried their dead, you also have representational imagery. And what's interesting about the catacombs is that Christians did not participate in the Roman practice of cremation because they believed in the resurrection of the body. So they needed to bury their dead. Catacombs were the places where they did that. And these loculi are like the bunk beds for the dead. So here you have the space where the dead body would have been laid. In these images, in the paintings in the catacombs, there's a typological interweaving of the figures from the Old and New Testament. So what does that mean? It means that for early Christians, figures in the Old Testament were types of Christ. So, for example, if you have Jonah in the whale for 3 days, that's a type for Christ being dead for 3 days before he rises again, just as Jonah is then spit out of the whale and sort of redeemed. So those kinds of types are found throughout the Old Testament, showing that the Old Testament was not cut off from the New Testament, but that the Messiah is present in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. In this image, you have Moses parting the Red Sea again, using that wand. And there's a great similarity between Moses represented here and Jesus here raising Lazarus. And this magic wand was actually a motif from Roman art and represented magic or power and that kind of thing. But again, it was reappropriated in a way to represent the power of God. The incredible symbolism of this piece has as much to do with what the image is as where it is. So for one thing, Christ is raising Lazarus, and this is painted right over a tomb. So it's a representation of resurrection. And not only does it represent resurrection, it enacts resurrection for the person who is buried there, who is hoping for the return of Christ and the resurrection of their body. Another theme that you will see in the catacombs is the orant figure. And again, the orant figure comes from Jewish and pagan references as well. It's a motif that's not exclusive to Christians, but it's a figure of who is praying. So they didn't sit with their hands folded quietly to pray. This was the stance of prayer, arms outstretched. The image of the Good Shepherd also had some roots in pagan art. And what was interesting is that Christians could use this image, and people might not necessarily know that they were using this as an image of Jesus, so they could kind of get away with things that they might not have otherwise been able to get away with when it could have even been dangerous to be a Christian. So in this image of the Good Shepherd, represented in the center here, it could be for a Roman pagan, a reference to Apollo or Hermes or the shepherd, Hermes the shepherd, or Orpheus among the animals. But for early Christians, there was no doubt that this was an image of the Good Shepherd, who was none other than Christ himself. You also see orant figures, again, here. And this is the picture of Jonah being swallowed by the whale. So again, we have this Christian subculture that's not a dominant culture, that then subverts imagery from the dominant culture and uses it to point to God. So now we're going to turn back to the Roman Empire, because we're going in chronological order, and the Christians were existing right there along with the Roman Empire. And we see a turn in the late Roman Empire to a different kind of characterization of the emperor. There was political unrest. There was instability in the late Roman Empire. And so the emperors became even more authoritarian and had to be portrayed even more fiercely. So he's characterized by an intense, fierce expression. And if you look at his eyebrows, you can see the shadow under his eyebrows is extremely dark. Those shadows are very dark. So there's a play in this sculptural piece between light and dark, using shadow for dramatic effect, creating a dramatic expression. And it's also a militaristic picture. I think it looks like somebody who could come out of a movie, or maybe a football player or something like that. But, okay, now we see a total contrast to this other portrait here. Just after Caracalla is part of the Severan dynasty. He's killed in 217. The last Severan Empire of this dynasty, was killed in 235. And there was anarchy for 50 years after that. Then Diocletian steps in to restore order, but he does so under an even more authoritarian rule. Diocletian divides the empire into two parts, each which is ruled by an Augustus, as he calls it, him and somebody else. Then he divides those 2 parts into another 2 parts. So he divides the empire into 4 parts. And the 4 parts are ruled by a tetrarchy, or the rule of 4. Tetrarchy includes each Augustus, and each Augustus has an heir, who is a Caesar. So this is a tetrarch, and we see an elevation of the metaphysical, rather than those fierce characteristic and militaristic characteristics, and rather than individual likeness that we saw earlier in Roman sculpture. Here, the human body is a symbol, not a naturalistic representation. So what does it symbolize? The sculpture here of the 4 tetrarchs shows them as abstracted geometric images. So these are the 4 rulers. And they are meant to look exactly the same. There was nothing different between them, no individuality. There's no difference between these rulers. It's to portray a united government, basically, ruling the empire. It suggests this unity, but it also suggests something about the political situation in the late empire. What they needed to portray, what kind of propaganda was necessary. They also are relating themselves to divinity once again, but they don't need to say that they are related to divinity. They actually claim to be inherently divine. By using these more metaphysical, abstracted, transcendent, geometric motifs in their sculpture, they are elevating themselves to divinity. They don't need Cupid to remind people that they have a divine lineage, because they are inherently divine themselves. Another thing to note is that the tetrarchs used porphyry, which is a purple stone. And purple was exclusive to the kings. It was extremely expensive. The dye for purple came from shellfish glands, which were very hard to come by. And so it became the color of the kings, and it could only be used by kings. So porphyry represented royalty, and purple still represents royalty to this day. So it's interesting to see where that comes from. Constantine replaces the tetrarchies. So he finds other sources of legitimization outside of the tetrarchic system. He sees himself, or calls himself, again, Apollo, and then he calls himself the unconquered sun god of the Near Eastern mystery religion. Then he takes on Christianity. So the story is that he was converted to Christianity when he saw a sign in the sky, and Christianity then becomes the imperial religion. It's no longer the oppressed minority. So as we'll see in the next lecture, there's a transformation of Christian art because of this. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which was a model of religious tolerance. He himself lived mostly in the east, in the eastern part of the empire, but this statue remained in the west as his presence. Remember, with Augustus Suprema Porta, we said that the statue of the emperor needed to be treated just like the emperor himself. So this sculpture of Constantine was like his presence in the West, where he hardly ever went. This was originally a portrait of Maxentius, his rival. Then he recarved it with his own features. There's a strong, idealized face with masculine features. There's a little bit of the style of the tetrarchy in this sculpture through that idealization. So after defeating Maxentius, he built the Arch of Constantine to commemorate that victory. And what's most interesting about this arch is the way that he used different styles from different times. So what we'll see here is that he took imagery, relief sculptures from a variety of different emperors. So these top circular relief sculptures come from the period of the Emperor Hadrian. Here we have an image of Hadrian hunting, which shows imperial power and strength and might, and Constantine wanted to be associated with that lineage. But what's most interesting is the stylistic shift shown between these two images. This section down here was carved in Constantine's time. Now, he chose these different images because he was building this arch as quickly as he could, so he just needed to grab what he could from other places. But we see here, in this is the detail of this bottom section pictured down here. Here it is. We see a stylistic shift in the art of the 4th century, and it was characterized by a flattened, hierarchical approach to representation. If you look here, you see the Roman style, the Greek style of sculpture, of classical sculpture, whereas with these figures, they're kind of squat, their heads are a little bit big, they don't look quite as realistic. They come out of the style of the Tetrarchy. So you see, again, hieratic scale, which we saw with Egyptians, where more important people are depicted as bigger than less important people. You also see the figures as smashed together, they're blocky, there's not really a strong sense of depth between the crowd of figures. Again, individuality is less important than idealized power. The Christian church takes up a bit of this style. And through the Arch of Constantine, we see that Constantine uses pagan as well as, well, I don't know if he's using Christian motifs here, but he still incorporates pagan motifs. He was a Christian, but he didn't completely let go of his previous allegiances. Another way in which early Christian architecture was influenced by Roman culture was through the early churches, imperial churches, not the house churches, but once the Christianity was the imperial religion, they were building bigger churches, right? The early Christian longitudinal churches derived from the Roman basilica, which was an imperial audience hall. So the nave, the narthex, these are words you might have heard in churches before, and these aisles all derived from the Roman basilica. But one thing that was new and inserted by Constantine's architects was the transept, which is at the end of the nave, and it's perpendicular to the long nave. This church, Old St. Peter's, could hold 14,000 people, first megachurch. This is a much smaller little church. This is a central plan building. It's not a longitudinal building, but its central access goes up and down. It's almost like a sphere. This building is the tomb of Constantina, the daughter of Constantine, and it became a church to commemorate her because she was made a saint later on. Originally, the walls of this church were covered with mosaics. And in these mosaics, here's an example of one of those mosaics, you see a fusion, this melding of Christian and Roman styles, Christian and pagan culture. So this section of the mosaic includes a bust portrait of Santa Costanza, or Saint Constantina. That's her portrait, and then she is surrounded by a decorative motif of grapevines and putti. The putti are the little cherub people, and they're the little naked cherubs. They are trampling grapes to make wine, down here, and they are traditionally associated with the cult of Bacchus, the god of wine. But in this context, the wine could also reference the Eucharist, the Christian Eucharist, and the death and resurrection of Christ for Christian eyes. So again, the appropriation of Roman symbols to mean something new. So these images of putti harvesting grapes refer to both the ritual of the Eucharist and pagan cults, the pagan cult of Bacchus, as well as the death and resurrection of Christ. So in the next chapter, or in the next week, as we continue this chapter, we will see a continuation of the use of Roman imperial imagery in Byzantine imagery that's used in support of the Byzantine Church. So we'll see that continuation. and a shift in the representations of Christ from a beardless shepherd to an imperial king. And we will look forward to looking at some more of that next week.